Yeah, and so like as you guys know, like wholesale, it really just takes volume, right? It kind of, and we can kind of talk about how the space has transitioned over time, but in the beginning it was simply a volume game. Reach out to as many distribution companies as possible, reach out to as many suppliers as possible, just reach out to as many people as possible and get as many touch points as you potentially could. Because you knew if you call 100 people, right, regardless of whether they're brands, distribution companies, closeout companies, whatever, if you call 100 people, you'll probably win 10, 15 of those, 20 of those, and out of those, maybe 2 or 3 of those will end up be profitable. But then over time, you learn how to increase your conversion of winning accounts. You learn how to increase your profitability with the accounts you win, and you just kind of continue to graduate and iterate the business, right?
E-commerce is the greatest business opportunity of our generation.
What is going on, people? Welcome back to another episode of the Ecom Unlimited podcast. It's your host, your boy Kaj, here with my co-host Josh.
What's going on, everybody?
And today we have one of the homies from the mecca of Amazon reselling, Southeast PA, the man, the myth, the legend, Garrett Goral, all out Amazon. How you doing, brother?
What's going on, guys? Thanks for having me. Quite the intro.
Well, it is deserved. But before we get into the full conversation for today, quick shout out to the sponsor of today's episode. That is Smart Scout. This is a tool we use in our business every single week when we're looking for new brands to partner with. We're doing brand outreach. We're analyzing brands, analyzing products, looking at keywords. It is an awesome tool. The owner of the tool, Scott Needham, has been an Amazon seller for a long time and is very involved in the space, and they're constantly coming out with new features as well, and they have some stuff in the works that I personally am very excited for. So now is a good time to get a free trial of Smart Scout. If you do not already have that tool, you can use code Ecom Unlimited or click the link in the bio to get that free trial and 25% off your first 3 months. And with that, let's hop into the conversation with Garrett. So I'm assuming a lot of people who are listening to the podcast are already aware of who you are. You've been in the space for a long time. We've had you on the podcast before, but for people who might not know who you are, can you just give the quick recap, your story and how you got into this space?
Years ago, during COVID. And so I went to school, I went to college, a typical 9 to 5 job, got a job out of college. This is 2018. 2018, I graduated college. Moved down to Pennsylvania, started working. At the time, obviously this is pre-COVID, I was working at a restaurant on the weekends, some weeknights, just to meet people, hang out, right, make some extra money. COVID came, obviously the restaurants, the whole industry shifted, whole industry closed down, and the world pretty much closed down. And so kind of looked at myself and I was like, I have a lot of extra time, more than I'm used to, right? Weekends opened up, weeknights opened up, and just didn't really have many places to go, much to do. And so I just naturally kind of ended up spending probably more time than I should have on social media, just scrolling, right? And I at the time, I think Reezy's videos were one of the first that I've kind of stumbled across. And at the time it was books. And again, this is what, 4 or 5 years ago, not nearly the sort of social media exposure than we have now. Right. So there wasn't much about Amazon reselling, all the things that we're used to now. So it was more of like a very, very more far-fetched idea. Right. So I started digging in, kind of doing more research, finding all the videos I could, right, because there were way less far in between. At some point, I just kind of, went to a Goodwill, started, scanning some books, just following the steps of the video, and continued to kind of iterate from there, right? At the time, I was making some good money. For me, scanning books, making, 60 cents, $1.50, $2 on a book wasn't necessarily going to cut it, right? That wasn't going to move the needle. It wasn't necessarily going to get me out of bed and go do that on the weekends, right? So started looking into it. I kind of like proved the concept of what reselling could be with the books, but pretty quickly pivoted and started looking to pivot and kind of advanced in the space, right? And so that's kind of where I quote unquote graduated to the online arbitrage space, right? So started obviously digging more in, stumbled across Keepa, right? Again, not nearly as much content as there is now. So started doing a lot of my own due diligence, trial and error, doing my round of the Lancaster, Philly outlets, Marshalls, Burlington Coat Factory. I would do that 4 or 5 days a week, Saturdays all day out just scanning stuff, Nike outlets, the whole deal there. And that was really what kind of allowed me to gain confidence in the model and know it could scale. Do some damage with spending more money. You could go out on a retail arbitrage run and spend pretty much as much money as you had, right? Hundreds, thousands of dollars. Um, and just continued to grow, right? I probably took longer to start posting than I should have. And I think Miles has told this story a bunch of times, right? There was just one random video. So I was following him for probably a couple months, couple weeks at this point. Started to kind of get engraved with the players in the space who had already existed, right? And I had commented on one of Miles's posts randomly, like answering a question or whatever. Like he had posted something. I actually think I corrected him. I may be wrong, but I think I corrected something that he said in the video, and he replied, right? And then he DM'd me. He was like, "Oh, let's get on a Zoom call." It, literally that night, so we hopped on a Zoom call. And at that point, that was probably one of the first times we had talked, and we've talked every day since. And that was 4 years ago, right? So that was kind of like the origination of like the Flips for Miles, all our Amazon relationship. Met Danny Wi-Fi through Miles. Obviously Jake Carter. That might have been before your guys' time, Jake Carter. Warner, right? We just started to kind of grow our inner circle to obviously what it has become today. And then we just have, continued to iterate, continue to learn together, continue to put out content, educating other people as we become educated. And that's kind of really how it all started.
And so when did you start doing wholesale in that? Because I know you kind of really hammered the online arbitrage for a while. You were also making a lot of YouTube videos specifically around Keepa for a while. I know you've had some threads on Twitter that went semi-viral about, how to use Keepa. So like, well, before we get maybe to the social media side of things, but just when did wholesale come into the picture?
It took a while. Honestly, it was probably over a year of just continuing to stack cash, continuing to grow familiar with the data, get confident in the data, get competent with the data. It took a while. There was one. I think it was sort of in 2024. It was at the beginning of 2024 when I dove head in, like feet first, or whatever the phrase is, head first into wholesale, right? As a new business model, but didn't necessarily continue stop cold turkey away, right? So I continued to build up, continued to buy away, right? But very much so started to spend more and more time on the wholesale space. And it was really just, I mean, you guys know, just volume game at the time, right? Just reaching out, sending emails, cold calling, opening up.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so like, as you guys know, like wholesale, it really just takes volume, right? It kind of, and we can kind of talk about how the space has transitioned over time, but in the beginning, it was simply a volume game. Reach out to as many distribution companies as possible, reach out to as many suppliers as possible, just reach out to as many people as possible and get as many touch points as you potentially could. Because you knew if you call 100 people, right, regardless of whether they're brands, distribution companies, closeout companies, whatever, if you call 100 people, you'll probably win 10, 15 of those, 20 of those. And out of those, maybe 2 or 3 of those will end up be profitable. But then over time, you learn how to increase your conversion of winning accounts. You learn how to increase your profitability with the accounts you win, and you just kind of continue to graduate and iterate the business, right? Obviously, the wholesale space back in the 2021 beginning is not what it is now, right? Things have changed, the marketplace has changed, the rules have changed. But in the beginning, it was just opening up a bunch of distribution accounts where we could, buying products when we could, and just continuing to kind of approach the business with that same OA mindset, just kind of cater to wholesale, right? Because we understand that the OA model is simply transactional, right? It's add products to cart, it's buy them, and then use the competitive advantage of OA, which is discounts, which is different manipulation tactics of prices to gain advantages and to make profits. But also like transitioning to the wholesale space, where your competitive advantage is way different. It's wildly different, right? Your pricing comes with your relationships. Your pricing comes with your positioning. Your pricing comes with the rapport and the history that you have with a particular company, right? Because a lot of times an account that you open off the bat is not going to look the same as it does in a year. Prices change, catalog maybe expands. You may have more exposure to different products, right? They may connect you to other sales reps who have different products in other departments, right? Things change, but the fact of the matter is you just got to get your foot in the door. And that was really the key in the beginning, is just getting my foot in the door with as many people as possible who are willing to talk to me as an Amazon seller, and then mature that relationship as I could.
Solid. And I kind of want to hear about what the back end of your wholesale operation looked like, because I know you've managed to have a pretty lean team kind of the whole way. Um, so did you ever have your own warehouse? Do you use 3PL? What the VA teams look like at your max? How many suppliers were you actively buying from? Like those kind of things.
So there was a period, and the timeline is foggy, but there was a period we had a warehouse for about a year and a half down in Delaware. Um, I think it honestly corresponded probably before the wholesale operation came up, because we tried the prep center model, like building a prep center, like a buy box banners prep center. You did that for a couple months. Nah, we didn't really like it, so we phased that out. So that was that was like why we got the prep center or the warehouse to begin with. Obviously having the warehouse made the transition to wholesale a bit easier. But in terms of like the structure, a lot of times it was just like me and my brother just kind of doing a lot of the work, doing a lot of the outreach, doing a lot of the back end stuff. Didn't really have a consistent VA until recently with the distribution business when it was really, really needed. But honestly, it wasn't it was pretty much just us two for a while.
Got it. Okay, so even when it came to catalog sourcing, just manually cranking through catalogs yourself.
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, we dabbled with what was it? It was like Scan Unlimited is one of
Yes.
the.
Yep. Yeah, we used
So
it
we
too back
never
in the
really
day.
found a ton of success with the tools like that, just because there's so many variables that come into play when it's coming with sourcing, right? It requires the human touch, right? Because maybe the UPCs don't match, the titles aren't perfect, right? The pricing, the numbers are changing, right? There's a lot of things that you end up missing when you're trying to use a sourcing tool, a scanning tool. So I've
Right.
found like ends up being honestly more efficient and more obviously profitable to just sift through, qualify one by one, right? Because if you even if you have a big catalog, there's a lot of things you can do to qualify the catalog as a whole and work your way down and kind of get into it in a more granular aspect, right? You start with brand by brand, right? You just type the brand into Amazon, see what comes up. If nothing comes up, okay, cross that one off, right? So you can start with like a whole catalog, drill that down to a list of brands, drill that down to a list of interesting brands. From there, kind of scope out what products exist within the brand. And a lot of times, similar to OA, good products hang out close to each other, right? So you may stumble across a good product in a particular brand. That product may have a 2-pack or a 3-pack or a different quantity, or I'm saying, or like different colors, or there's like a science to going through a catalog. And I think the best way to do it is just kind of just brute forcing your way with that human touch.
And then, like, as you're kind of sifting through this catalog and you go to place like your first PO, let's say, you have a product, it's doing pretty good volume. On that first order, what are you looking for in terms of kind of like return as you go to place that first wholesale order, knowing that there might be better pricing down the road?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the way I like to think about it is every order is sort of like its own profit and loss, right? Every product is not going to look the same. Every product is not going to bring back the same margins, but overall, the whole order should hold certain standards, regardless of what each individual product looks like. And the reason why I say that is because different companies obviously abide by different standards. One company may have a $20,000 discount threshold where if you hit that, you get an extra 10% off, right? Every product is not going to be 10% discounted. One product may be, 5% margin or 6% margin. But if you add spend with those particular products, well, then that gets you over the threshold and that opens up other products. You see what I'm saying? It's like every order should kind of be considered its own like profit and loss, because as a whole, if you think about it like that, right, you open up more opportunities, um, and your business continues to kind of take steps forward, right? But generally speaking, on the product level, just like a rough guideline, every product we bring in should bring in anywhere between like $400 or $500 per month, right? That's kind of like the standard, because again, that common denominator allows you to say yes to a lot of different sorts of products. Product that may sell, you may be able to sell 50 times $4 or $5, or $10 50 times. You know what I'm saying? Like different profit and quantity gets you to that same common denominator value metric in a lot of different ways. And so every product that goes into a PO should bring in anywhere between like $400 or $500 as a minimum. And of course, the actual metrics that go into that could vary. But again, that allows us to continue to contribute to a PO in a profitable and productive way, but also open up other opportunities as that PO grows, if that makes any sense.
I really like that.
Yeah. So when you're looking at a purchase order, you're more concerned about figuring out how much profit a specific product is going to add in versus just like what's the ROI or what's the margin. Do you have, or would you recommend, to someone listening to this podcast to have like a minimum margin cutoff, or it's like, even if it's super slim, as long as the return rate's okay and you can get that profit, you should just still buy it,
I
assuming
mean,
you have the capital?
in a perfect world, ideally around 10%, right? That should be kind of like the standard. I mean, and the other thing is, right, as you continue to grow, you may, with other volume, the calculations may make sense to drop your overall margin to 8 or 9%. But as like a rough standard, especially getting going, 8 to 12% minimum should be probably very achievable. And obviously, every product looks different based on return rates and volume and consistency, things like that, right? A product that's existed between $10 and $12 for 2 years, well, maybe you'd be more willing to say yes to a 7% margin on that product because you have 2 years of data that says, this is gonna be the price, this is kind of like the consistent sales volume, and there's more dependability, right? It's like, the way I like to think about, like, on the product level qualification is like, it's kinda like a stool, right? Every stool has 3 legs, and ideally, they're the same length, but it may not always be perfect, right? So in terms of volume, profitability, and stability, those are kinda like the 3 legs that make up a good product, right? But when you have, because you can't have 2 and have a good product, right? If something's not stable, or if something's not profitable, or if something doesn't sell, right? You have to have some quality, like some part of every single one of those metrics to make up the entire equation. But every single product has different levels of each, right? The ideal product is very stable, very profitable, and very volume driven as a whole, but is obviously not that case every single time.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I like to point that out to people too when they're looking at products, whether it's brand direct, OA, or wholesale. I think when you start off with a supplier, you're more than likely going to have to sacrifice really like, I like to look at it as, if I'm going to make a big sacrifice on one of those legs, and then the other two should be solid. And then that's like kind of a green light to move forward the product. And then as you build the relationship over time, then the one place where you kind of sacrificed, whether that's the velocity or the margin, whatever, over time, building the relationship should kind of help strengthen that side of it too. And that's kind of like perfect example. And me and Josh talk about this all the time, but like with brand direct, not a lot of times, but we have multiple brands where they started off pretty much break even. But we knew that once we get the exclusive locked in, we can raise the buy box price. And because there's already brand recognition, like, people are still looking for the branded product, so the volume doesn't actually slow down. And our pricing doesn't change from the supplier, but because we raised the buy box price, because we're exclusive, now it's like, okay, a product that was, it's selling 300 times a month, making no money, now it's selling 300 times a month, and we're making multiple $1,000s a month in profit just from that product. So kind of the same sort of idea there, even whether it's a distributor or brand direct.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's really kind of, I don't know if you guys were headed this way, but kind of how like the space has changed, right? Back in the day, we would be buying from closeout companies, distribution companies that we've never heard of, right? Random distribution companies from Google, et cetera, et cetera. But obviously in 2025, that model doesn't necessarily work. You need to be buying from the brand or a representation of the brand. Essentially, you have to be as close to the brand as possible for all sorts of authenticities and supply chain verifications, because Amazon's getting, as they should, right, as we would want them to, get very, very strict and stringent with what products they're allowing and accepting onto their marketplace, right? Because there's no place for fake products and fraudulent companies, because that ruins the experience for everyone, right? It ruins the experience for the customers. They want to go somewhere else, crushes markets, kills the values of different brands, right? So we want them to be doing these sorts of things because, again, the people who play the game right, who are buying authentic products from authentic companies, are going to win long term, regardless of where they're selling it, how they're selling it, when they're selling, right? And so again, in 2025, as you alluded to, that's the only way to be successful. The only way to continue to grow is to work with companies that, you know, are directly correlated to the brand, or work with the brands itself. And I think those are really the only two options of buying from different companies as you continue to get into wholesale.
Yeah. And I think you've done like a really good job at being able to position yourself with larger companies to be able to supply sellers with really good inventory that, can flow back to if the paperwork is required of a fraudulent request to these big brands. How, and this is just out of curiosity, how did you get in, position and like kind of position yourself to one, meet these individuals and kind of work with them to allow kind of, and build that trust to be able to place these like large orders with like really good paperwork?
So getting into like the my main goal, my main vision when kind of like pulling back on the Amazon selling things and getting into the distribution model was to shrink the gap between the brands and the sellers. Right? Because that was my main complaint with wholesale is you don't necessarily know the person you're buying from, the company you're buying from. They could have already bought from a company, who already bought from a company, who already bought from a company, and so on and so forth. Right? So when the typical Amazon seller is buying a product, that product could already have been transitioned across 4 or 5 different distribution companies, each taking their margin, and then originating obviously from the brand. And that's best case. Worst case is it originates from somewhere else. It just goes to those same channels and ends up in the Amazon seller's perspective, right? And so me coming from the Amazon perspective, having a brand, having a platform where people could trust, I was like, okay, I have the people, right? I know and I have an understanding of how to open up these accounts. Right now, there's a big gap in terms of the common Amazon seller and the brand, right? There's a huge, huge gap. That's a big, big misconception in terms of the entire supply chain, right? So what can I do as someone who has a following, as someone who has a brand to shrink that gap, right? And so for whatever reason, I went overseas, right? Because I assumed a lot of products were originating overseas. And obviously there's some complications there and there's a moat there because a lot of people just naturally don't want to be able to have to deal with all the things that correspond with buying products overseas. But I started reaching out to companies in Europe that imported to America as a way to shrink that gap as much as possible, right? To eliminate the 3, 4, 5 different middlemen, right? Eliminate the all the people that take their margins to essentially boil it down to 3 different people: the manufacturer, me, and then the Amazon seller. Because me, coming from an Amazon seller, having people that trust me, having a reputation to continue to uphold, it's in my best interest to act in accordance to the Amazon's best interest, right? Because that's obviously how, happy customers lead to more customers, right? And so that was my main goal, is to shrink the gap between the brand and the seller as much as possible, but also while continuing to uphold the standards of what products should be in the Amazon seller, right? Knowing that Amazon has all these new legislation and restrictions in terms of where their products could come from, this, that, and the other thing, right? And so being a quote unquote brand aggregator, as I call it, not necessarily like a distribution company, but like an aggregator of brands, a company that represents a lot of different brands, right? Putting them in front of Amazon sellers, but in a way that um, makes the whole process way less scary. Because I think that was also one of the big misconceptions for OA sellers is they hear about this whole big bad wholesale model, but they don't necessarily want to know how to get into it. They don't necessarily want to make a bunch of cold calls, right? They don't necessarily want to spend the 6, 7, 8 months building a wholesale connection business, a supply chain. Um, and so it's a way to create efficiencies within the OA seller that wants to get into wholesale. It's a way to create efficiencies with the existing wholesale seller that maybe just wants to add some more products to their desk, to their catalog, right? And to create efficiencies and consolidate all the things that were really complicating the wholesale model for really sellers of all levels. Um, and that was really the platform, the building block that I was able to use. And then it was just a matter of finding the products and then just supplying them with the sellers and kind of figuring it out as I went.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then the fact that you're able to even like go overseas and meet with them. I mean, that's so huge with the reputation that you had online with all these different sellers. It's just really a unique, position that you had that, potentially businesses are looking for because they don't want to have to interact with tons of sellers online. They rather just make it as basically as streamlined as possible. And you're looking to fix that need, which is really cool.
Well, I mean, that's I'm part of that. This is part of the thing that you guys do as a brand partner and as that sort of component to a brand's kind of vision and their brand portfolio. But in the same token, right, a lot of brands who work with 5, 6, 7 different distribution companies around the world, right, want to and can consolidate it with 1 or 2 brands, aggregators, whatever, right? And I think that's part of the new wave of kind of Amazon as a platform, as an economy, right? Just consolidating the whole thing, either working with one person or a small trusted group that have a lot of access, right? And that's not necessarily confined to and refined to just one marketplace, multiple countries, right? Brick and mortar, Amazon, Walmart, all the things, right? The brands want access to as much as possible with as little trouble as possible.
Yeah, that last piece right there, with as little trouble as possible, is one thing I've been learning more and more about. I was at a trade show a couple months ago, and there was like the little after party, whatever, just people networking and talking. And I was talking with this one guy who does like brand exclusive wholesale, but he's not an e-commerce guy. Well, I guess he does sell on Amazon too, but just like at a massive level. So like when he partners with the brand, he's partnering with international brands and he gets exclusivity by country. So he was telling me, he's like, I just buy wholesale, and anything that gets sold in the US, it's me. And I'm like, that's just like absolutely mind blowing. But it goes back to your point of like, the brands just want as little headache as possible. So the brand literally gets one check. I'm sure it's probably like quarterly or monthly, whatever, one check from this guy, and then his company just handles the rest. And that's kind of what you were able to do for some of these brands too, because it's like, if I understand correctly, they were selling directly to like multiple different Amazon sellers, and then your pitch was kind of like, hey, just sell to me. I have a network, and then you just need to deal with one
I
check.
mean, they were
and then I'll
using
handle the
5 or
rest.
6 different importers to bring into America, right? And me, someone who has like, I live with an online resume, right? You can Google my name, you can pull out you can see the thousands, the tens of thousands of people that follow me, the 200 podcasts, all the things that I've been building over the past 3, 4, 5 years. And I mean, it's hard to poke a hole in any of that, right? And so that's kind of the value add of, spending 4 years of your life talking about this stuff and really just committing to it.
At what point did building a distribution company become the goal? Because I'm sure like when you first got into it, like that first Zoom call with Miles, it wasn't like, all right, the master plan is a distribution company, or maybe it was, but I'm just curious, at what point along the journey did it kind of click that this was something that would work for you?
Um, at some point, probably midway through last year, 2024. Okay, so I have my best and most creative thoughts when I'm running, right? When I'm in the
Okay.
solitude, the Schuylkill Valley Trail, the Chester Valley, you guys probably know.
Oh
And
yeah.
I remember,
Yeah.
I specifically remember the run. I was on the Schuylkill Valley. I was near King of Prussia. I was running. I was like, that kind of actually makes a lot of sense. I have to do it just like I was talking about. Like I have all the people I need with all the spending power I could ever want. I have a brand, people that trust me, right? Loyalty, and I have products, right? And I have the availability and the capability to connect those two. Again, it was really as simple as, consolidating the supply chain that really frustrates a lot of people, not knowing where they're getting products from, not knowing the prices, all those sorts of things, right? And one of the things I always talk about with distribution companies is it's very difficult to qualify a distribution company up front, right? Because you don't necessarily know the pricing. A lot of times you don't even necessarily know the products and the brands that they carry, right? That's the advantage of going brand direct is you can qualify from an Amazon perspective, reverse engineer it to the brand, reach out to the brand and go from there, right? You can qualify based on all the data that you want, right? You can load up a Keepa search that says, okay, I'm looking for products within the arts and crafts category that are ranked 100 under 150,000 that no Amazon is on the seller or no Amazon exists in the market, right? 3 or more sellers, all those things that are highly rated 3 or 4 stars, right? And you'll have a list of 30, 40, 50 brands that represent all the things, your mold of a perfect brand, of a small or of an ideal brand. You can filter on the small to medium-sized brands within that market. You have a list of 30, 40 brands that are already qualified, Well, now you just call them and open up the accounts, right? Obviously, it's not as easy as that, but you already have all that qualification done, right? But with the distribution model, if you're going Google or whatever, it's hard to map those back to a particular product of interest. It's hard to map those back and kind of have an understanding of what sorts of pricing they could potentially offer and everything in between, right? And so, from a wholesale perspective, I've always gone brand direct just because it simply made more sense. Also, just coming from like a OA reverse sourcing perspective, start with a product, qualify it, it meets all your checkpoints, figure out the price at the end. Wholesale is the same way. If you could find the product, check all your boxes of what that product looks like, while understanding that price point, whether really you're talking about OA or wholesale, is always going to be the most variable aspect of the equation. It's always going to be the most manipulatable, whether you're using a discount code or whether you're using a wholesale sales rep. Price point's always going to be the most manipulatable, so why not save it for last, right? Because if you have to force it into existence by adding another product or two products or juice up your order a bit, there's always something you can do to change your price, but you can't do anything to change the sales rank. Can't do anything to change the instability of a product. You can't change anything. You can't kick Amazon off the market, right? There's a lot of things you cannot control. And so why not start with those, index on all those, and then figure out the price point at the last point? Because again, that's the most changeable. That's the biggest lever you have.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially for someone who's newer, kind of thinking through that flow. And another thing I like to tell people who are starting out, or whether they're just trying to figure out, where they want to land and double down on in the space, if you're already doing a bunch of different models, is like think through that framework that Garrett kind of just explained, and then figure out where your strengths lie, and then go double down there. And that's like for me personally why I love brand direct, because one of my strength is like the relationship management of it, the strategic thinking versus like OA. Like I was decent at the back end systems, but I just frankly was not a good OA sourcer, right? But when it comes to brand direct, I'm much better at doing the brand outreach, establishing that relationship, building trust, building that strategic partnership for the long term. And so that kind of like lines up better with where I'm skilled at. And then like obviously, the Amazon landscape is changing. I do personally think that OA exposes you to more risk than a brand direct. But at the same time, it's like there's still people who are absolutely crushing it OA. Like they're buying from good places. They might run into inauthentic complaints more, but they're beating them. They have good margins, they have good systems, and it's still working for them. So like, yes, I'm very brand direct biased, but like all the models work. You just have to make sure that you're playing the game the right way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a different sort of risk because obviously, from an OA perspective, you're pretty confident the products are going to be legit, right? It's hard for Amazon to deny a Dick's Sporting Goods invoice or receipt, 10 times straight. But I think the bigger risk when it comes to OA is just the market risk, right? Individual market risk, because then you have to deal with sales cycles. You have to deal with discount codes that you potentially don't know. You have to deal with all sorts of, and you have to deal with inexperienced Amazon sellers, which obviously also can adjust the overall product market in its own right, right? And so you have to deal with all these sorts of things in terms of a more volatile market on a product level. Whereas with wholesale, it's a lot more moated when it comes to prices, when it comes to opening up these accounts. And so it's a different risk for sure, I would say.
Yeah.
I do have a question here, Garrett. When tariffs, I know you're a big importer from Europe. When tariffs were first implemented, how worried were you? Like, what was your initial reaction? Are you like, oh my gosh, it's all over? Or like what? And like, how did you kind of, I don't know, just kind of talk through it and kind of, come up with potential, solutions that you might have been facing at all?
So at first, I didn't really lose any sleep. I didn't really think much of it because I just didn't. And this is probably on me. I didn't really take them seriously. There's a lot of talking when it comes to like politics and the government and all those and
Right.
the global economy. I didn't really think much of it. But like after a few weeks, and then the talks got more significant, and then the numbers were getting thrown around, and I was like, oh shoot, like this is probably going to actually happen, right? And then there were actually deadlines and all sorts of things, right? But um, honestly, it was difficult because I mean, taking money out of all of our pockets, right? And obviously, you guys buy from us. We tried to minimize the impact for all of our customers as much as possible, right? So we did one price adjustment that I think ended up being like 2 to 5% on most products. So as minimal as possible, and then our suppliers ate some of the margin. We ate some of the not the margin, but like the tariff. And so we just kind of like split it up. But the value we had is before the tariffs existed, we were already doing $300, $400, $500 an hour orders a month, right? And so they didn't want to lose the business just as much as we didn't.
Right.
And so it behooved them, because we earned it, um, to figure out a way to make it work, right? And so they were very gracious to take probably more than they needed to, and that left with us with a lot smaller of a chunk to kind of eat on the back end. But yeah, it was. I mean, it sucked, obviously, but
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting how that plays into effect, and I appreciate your perspective on
Yeah.
that and how that works, because I know a lot of people, even like myself, like I was like, I don't really know how this is going to shake up. Who's going to really like eat the cost here? Are the prices on Amazon just going to go up 20% just because we got 20% or 25% tariffs coming in? So I thought that was obviously an interesting time period that we're still
but
kind
it.
of living in.
I mean, yeah,
Um,
we're still going through it. And logistically, it was actually interesting because, like, once there were like specific dates in question, then it was a matter of whether the boat has left the port, whether the boat's in port. You're talking
Oh,
tens of thousands of dollars of a difference,
Right.
literally
right?
just from getting the boat out
Wow.
one day. Oh,
That's
It's literally like
crazy.
from like Europe's perspective, as soon as the boat leaves the port, like, and there's boundaries, right? As soon as the boat leaves that area, if it left, then and we're talking about obviously like when tariffs are activated, right? And so
Right.
there was like always like a rush before a deadline to get things moving, get the boat out, because also like our company's employees aren't at the port. The port is like government employees, like it has nothing to do with them, it has nothing to do with us, it has nothing to do with anyone. Right. And so it's like we got to get these things moving, because when you have a $300,000 order already loaded, and we're talking another 10% on top of that,
Yeah.
just as opposed to if something left at 12 o'clock in the afternoon or 2 o'clock, that's where it gets kind of hairy. But yeah, it was like there were times where it was like the difference of hours was very costly or beneficial, just based on how, like, if it was in like a neutral water or not.
did
insane.
you end up running into that where something like
Twice.
either did you beat the timeline or did you
Yeah.
just miss the timeline?
Yeah, we beat it.
Sick.
Let's go. That's our
That's
guy
awesome.
right there.
That's so
It's
cool.
funny. I saw a tweet recently that the essence of it was just be really easy to work with. And I think like the story that you were just explaining shows the value of that. Like the fact that the people that you're working with were willing to eat some of the tariff cost increase. Obviously, like you still ate that too. Some of the customers had to eat it because it's not fair for one person to take all of that, and probably not feasible. But the fact that they were willing to take, like you said, maybe a little bit more than their fair share, just shows the value of building a relationship, being easy to work with, sending the check when it needs to be sent, and then just doing what you got to do. And then, it kind of ends up coming back around.
Well, I mean, that's again, like, that's the competitive advantage when you're talking about wholesale. Like, when my wife and I were on our honeymoon, our sales rep bought us Manchester United tickets, right?
So
They were like
sick.
$400 each. They were like really good seats, but like that's the sort of like the relationships that you have to aim for. And of course, not every relationship with every company is going to be like that,
Right.
but that's like the sort of mindset that you have to have when you're having these conversations, right? You have to have a personal level, because you and I can have the same account and with the same sales rep and get different pricing, and that's the name of the game, right? And that's the competitive advantage with wholesale as opposed to OA, right? It's obviously your relationship, your rapport, but also your longevity with a company, the spend that you had, the street cred you had with them, like all that stuff matters.
Yeah, 100%. I'm curious. So obviously, right, distribution company working with brands, you're selling directly to Amazon sellers. I'm assuming most of your customers have come from like the initial times when you've posted about what you're doing. Like obviously that's how we, have started working with you in that capacity, just because you posted about it. So we reached out. I think that also happened, through the wholesale network too, because you've been putting deals in there. But my question is, do you now get spam with emails from Amazon sellers asking about opening an account, or like getting not spam calls, but just like getting tons and tons of calls or emails from Amazon sellers?
Yeah, I mean, because obviously it comes from a lot of different ways. Like, the thing is, when you have a quality product, it gets around, right? So our leads come from a lot of different ways, right? So we have a bunch of people that buy from us who probably all have friends of Amazon sellers. Then it's like, oh, like I just ordered this, you know what I'm saying? So the word of mouth. We have a website, right? So that also, we have organic inbound leads that come every week. And then obviously as people join like the wholesale network, talk with you, like people come from all sorts of, and the fact of the matter is, right, people always want products, right? Good products from good sources. That's never going to change. And so I would expect and anticipate the leads to continue to come, because our customers get good prices, right? Everything is transparent, right? Everything is very sort of straightforward. And that's how we operate. And that's kind of reflected on our continued exposure. But yeah, I mean, there's way more people than products inbound for sure.
Yeah, so you don't have a problem of who to sell the product to.
And I also don't even talk about it, right? I haven't talked about it really
Oh,
publicly in
yeah,
months. I think I put out a tweet like a couple weeks ago, but like I haven't really promoted it on social media in like 6 to 8 months, right? And
wow,
a lot of that has to do with us being very, very particular and strategic with who we open up accounts with, right?
right,
And so we can't say yes to everyone, and we don't want to say yes to everyone, right? Because your ideal client should be very specific and cater to, right? Obviously, who you find value with. And I just like doing business with people I like, right? Like
right,
you, Spizak, like all some of the OGs, right? Those are the people that I like doing business with because those are people I like hanging out with. It just makes the whole
exactly.
process easier, right? And of course, like the distro business is also really interesting, and this is also one of the things that I um initially got me into it, was right, like scaling your audience. There's a lot of different ways to go about it, right? You can come out with any sort of course or material or educational stuff, but that's always going to be received subjectively, right? Two people can receive ingest a course, but they're going to have two different opinions, right? Based on pre-existing knowledge, based on how they learn, based on a lot of different factors. A course can be received differently by 10 different people, 10 different ways, 10 different people, right? A, advanced, like a high ticket mentorship can be received differently from 4 different people, right? You onboard 4 different people, have 4 different results based on their pockets, based on their way of learning, based on all the things that are going on, right? 4 different ways. But with the distribution model coming from like an analytical mind, well, the results are not negotiable, right? I gave you a product, you made X amount of dollars, the price was this, you made Y, and the outcome was Z, right? That's non-negotiable, that's non-debatable, and that's just set in stone. Right, and so in terms of like a big audience, in my mind, one of the best ways to monetize an audience selfishly was to provide products to people, again, because that's something that's not subjective, it's quantifiable. Profit, profit, profit. And that's also something where it's mutually beneficial, right? When I'm winning, my customers are winning. When my customers make a lot of money, they come back and buy more, which makes me more money. And so that's something where the goals are aligned, right? They're parallel, right? We're going in the same direction. Where I feel like a lot of offers and a lot of things in the social media space are not that way, right? And so in my mind, this was like the perfect situation to monetize a big audience that I put a lot of time and effort into, where all the goals, all the results are aligned, and also something that couldn't be subjectively entertained and disputed, because that was also something that was super important.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I didn't think about it that way, but when you phrase it like that, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's awesome that you have like that sweet flywheel that, if somebody's doing good, you're doing good. If somebody's doing good, you're doing good. Because that thing's just going to keep spinning faster and faster. And it's just, again, as you said, profit, profit, profit.
But the other thing is, so I feel like a lot of reason why distribution companies fail is that they index on like the wrong part of the supply chain, right? Because obviously the prices are what they are, right? And the Amazon sellers are profiting what they do. But there's a lot of variability in that, right? Because your prices could potentially get better as your spending grows and things like that. But I think a lot of the distribution companies, especially from what I've seen, kind of keep the Amazon seller dollars at like a flat line, right? If you get better prices, well, you take the margin as opposed to the Amazon sellers, right? Right. So whatever that is, like 7-8%, it's just I feel like a sliding scale, regardless of what the price is, in terms of what the Amazon seller margin is, right? And so if your product is seeing you're getting 20%, well, a lot of people, I think, keep the Amazon seller margin at like that 8, 9, 10%, and then pocket whatever's left. Whereas I like to try and keep the sliding scale in the favor of the Amazon seller, because I know that means more for me in the long term, right? right? Because obviously you guys, some products are 17% margin, some will be 12, some will be 13, some will be 14, some will be 8, right?
Yeah.
But overall, they're all profitable. Whereas I think a lot of times you look at a catalog, it's like, oh, weird, they're all like 8, 9%, 10%, right? That's kind of strange.
Yeah, that's a good point. And even like getting back to your certain point with like, hey, if you hit the 20K threshold, you could potentially get better pricing off of the whole order. And and then you're only seeing, 3, 5, 9. It's like, oh man, it's going to be tough to get to, that potential 20K threshold, looking at capital and looking at my cash flow with the business. So that's super interesting. Where can people go find you on the internet, Garrett, if they want to learn more?
So our website, our Northeast Wholesale Supply website, it has all like the information in terms of like filling out the application, getting in touch with our team. Obviously I exist on Twitter, mainly, although Amazon, that's where you can find me. Well, my the resume of tweets and stuff. And I have like hundreds of videos that exist on YouTube.
Awesome. Guys, links will be in the description, so go check out Garrett. Thank you for listening today. Make sure to leave a comment if you have any topics you want us to discuss in the future. And if you're on YouTube, like and subscribe. And if you're on Spotify, follow the podcast so you can stay updated on all of our new content. And we will see you on the next one.